Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you reside. Welcome to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm Stewart Patrick, Senior Fellow and Director of Carnegie's Global Order and Institutions Program, and the moderator of this event, in which we'll be discussing the insights from a fascinating new book, Children of a Modest Star, Planetary Thinking for an Age of Crises. We're fortunate to be joined by the book's authors, Jonathan Blake and Nils Gilman of the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, as well as my friend and colleague, Olivia Lazard, who's a Carnegie Fellow based in Europe and an expert on climate change and energy security, amongst other things. She's also advised the European Commission's thinking on how to conceive of and grapple with environmental security issues. I also especially want to thank Jonathan for getting up so early in California. It's 6 a.m. there, and that probably violates several state regulations as well as some UN human rights conventions. So thanks for getting up, Jonathan. In a moment, I'm going to turn to some initial questions to Jonathan and Nils, but first I wanted to set the stage with just a few remarks. Children of a Modest Star, which I commend to each and every one of you, is really the latest important contribution in a growing body of work and literature by experts who are interested in what we collectively think of as planetary politics. While this concept doesn't really have a consensus definition, it essentially stems from the recognition that humanity, thanks to a combination of technological progress, demographic growth, mass consumption, resource exploitation, and other anthropogenic activities, has entered into a fundamentally new relationship with the living planet. We've altered the atmosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the cryosphere, which I, in recent years, have discovered means the Earth's frozen regions. But regardless of whether or not geologists formally christen the era that we're in as the Anthropocene, what's unique about our era is that humans are the most important and powerful force shaping the Earth system, for good, or as is more often the case, for ill. This recognition that we are a fully planetary species is a moment of world historical and indeed cosmological significance. But it also poses a lot of challenges for political organization, since, as I think we're going to hear from our authors, the existing international system finds it increasingly difficult to cope with problems that are essentially planetary in scope. I want to remind participants on this call that they can ask questions in the YouTube comments section, and we'll try to get to those if time permits over the next 75 minutes. With those preliminaries, let me turn to the authors for some initial observations or reflections. Let me start with Nils. Why did you and Jonathan decide to write this book? And why did you pick the title you did? Was there a precipitating trend or event that spurred you to actually take on what is a very ambitious project?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Stewart. And thank you, Olivia, and thank you, Carnegie, for having us on this call. So the book, John and I first started discussing writing this book in the summer and fall of 2020. We will all remember what was going on in the summer and fall of 2020. Obviously, it was the height of the pandemic. The vaccines were in the pipeline, but we didn't know how long it would take or when they would work, and we didn't know how bad the pandemic would be. And the pandemic is, in fact, one of the, as it were, model animals for the book in terms of defining planetary challenges. The two main case examples that we use to talk about planetary issues are the pandemic on the one hand and climate change on the other. But there are other examples of planetary challenges, such as ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, disruptions to the nitrogen cycle, space junk, if you want to take things a little bit more far afield, quite literally. And what all of these things have in common, what we refer to in the book as planetary phenomena, is that they are things that don't respect our borders. Most of the things that people talk about with respect to globalization, the global as opposed to the planetary, are things that are flows of human things that are intentionally being moved around the world by humans for human reasons. So we move money, we move goods, we move ideas, we move people. These are all human-centered things. But these other things, like the carbon molecules and the viruses, are also things that affect humans, that humans may be affecting in turn themselves, but they're not things that move around because our borders constrain us in various ways. They move regardless of the constraints of borders. And the reason why the pandemic was the key moment for us that spurred us to decide to write this book is that you all remember that the reaction of our governance institutions to the advent of the pandemic in 2020 was to retreat to the national. We had decades of more and more increasing openness in terms of trade, in terms of goods and flows of services and people and movement and tourists and so on. And when the pandemic struck, the reaction of nation states was to close the borders and try to manage the pandemic nationally, internally, with their national health systems. And it didn't work. I mean, the key point about this is that nations asserted their sovereignty as a way to kind of deal with the pandemic, but because the viruses don't care about the borders, they just kept moving. And even a country that is as high capacity and as fiercely devoted to its sovereignty as China, which tried to close the borders and tried to stamp out every instance of the virus everywhere it came, after 2.5 years, 3 years, they gave up and eventually allowed, in the beginning of 2023, for the virus to rip through the population. It just was not a feasible way. It was not an effective way to deal with a challenge like a virus. And the same thing goes for climate change, right? When we emit emissions out of our tailpipes or out of the factory smokestacks, those carbon molecules go in the air and they reshape the planetary climate. It doesn't happen the same way everywhere, but it's a planetary phenomena, and it doesn't care. The planet doesn't care whether those carbon molecules are coming out of a tailpipe in Beijing or in South Africa or in Los Angeles. It affects us all on a planetary basis. So that's really the point of departure, was seeing that the institutional architecture we have for dealing with these issues was fundamentally inadequate for dealing with these issues, particularly for climate change and the pandemic.
That's a terrific overview, Nils, and we'll definitely get back to that. I want to get back to distinguishing sort of what are planetary phenomena versus sort of just the management of interdependence, and then also we'll get back later on to some of these sovereignty issues and the international system and its abilities and frailties. But I want to talk a little bit to try to situate this in sort of broader thinking about what it means, in a sense, to be a planetary species and human relations with the Earth. One of the things that I found most refreshing, partly because I like to geek out on things like the history of science, and sort of through lines in terms of not just Western thought and literature, but thought and literature in general, is the fact that the book takes pains to look at this moment that we're in as a critical juncture, but also one that had some antecedents in terms of intellectually. So, Jonathan, I know that's a specific interest of yours, and you try to situate the book in terms of this debate. Are there areas or particular philosophers, theologians, or prophets that sort of you examined and you see sort of this as a natural development, or is this a fundamentally new departure in the way of thinking about our relationship to planet Earth?
Yeah, well, to echo Nils, thank you to everyone involved here for having us. So the way we frame the book is in terms of a series of what we call decenterings that have happened over the course of the last couple centuries, beginning with what is often called the first great Freudian trauma to the human species, which was or the first great decentering is that of Copernicus, right? Who and other astronomers in kind of the early modernity, who from their observations of the stars, of the heavens, came to realize quite heretically that the Earth was not the center of the universe, right? That in fact the Earth rotated around the sun and not vice versa. So kind of the rejection of Earth-centered view and kind of the replacement with the heliocentric view of the universe was this first kind of great blow to the notion of we humans as the absolute center of everything. That, okay, well, now we know actually the universe does not revolve around us in a literal way. And then The second great decentering kind of in this scheme is that of Darwin, who decenters humans as the kind of unique and special product of divine creation. And in fact, Darwin shows that, well, we're just one element of the vast tree of life, and that we kind of all evolved over time. And that, humans kind of sit there along with apes and, further field with other mammals, and then back to all other things. So this is kind of, so we go from the first great decentering having to do with the place of the planet in the universe, then the second great decentering, the place of humans among all of life. And then the third great decentering, as we call it, is this realization of the planetary, the category that Stewart, you mentioned kind of in your introduction, that says that humanity or human beings are not apart from nature, but a part of nature. That they're the kind of the separation that we've long understood ourselves, in the West at least, this fundamentally modern notion that human beings are set aside from the rest of nature, that we can dominate it, that we can control it, that we can dam every river and hunt every animal, or that we can turbocharge agriculture and and all these things. That what scientists have been showing us progressively with more detail over the course of roughly the past century and a half, is that vision is false. That in fact we are a part of the biosphere, that we are entirely reliant on the chemical flows and the physical nature, and the technical term being kind of the biogeochemical processes that sustain all life on the planet. So we describe this again as kind of the third of these major moments in the history of science, but that then all of them end up being not just scientific moments, but political moments and philosophical moments that really force people to rethink who we are, and our place on the planet, or place in the cosmos. And the specific story that we trace, that I think you're referring to, is of a series of scientific thinkers since Darwin, who came to understand two things. One, that it's not enough to look at individual creatures on their own, and that you need to understand whole systems. This traces the idea of the development of the idea of ecosystems, right? That it's not enough to just look at what one bird does, that you need to understand that bird in its context, that involves both the things they eat, and the plants that they sit on and nest in, but also even the abiotic, the non-living things, the water, the minerals, etc. So progressively we start to understand, okay, you can't just look at the individual, you look at the system, and then we start to understand systems of systems, and building up at various moments over the course of the 20th century, to kind of get this more holistic and comprehensive view that sees humans as fully embedded in networks of life and non-living things, including energy and so it takes. I mean, you mentioned theologians, and there's actually a surprising amount of theology in the book that we didn't expect were going to come about. But at the end, when we say things like that, humanity is embedded in all nature, these are not meant as spiritual statements or ethical statements, though there are implications for those who want to take it that way. We mean it as a factual scientific statement, that there is no human thriving without the thriving of the other creatures and the planet itself that we live on. Because if they die, we die too.
Yeah, I have to say that one of the things that I found most compelling about the book was the original was the degree to which you were able to bring in Earth system science with these philosophical traditions, and also making the point that our existing paradigms of international relations, the way we think about international relations, political science, if you will, do not actually integrate Earth system science in any sort of fundamental way. And I think that was very useful. One of the I want to get back to something I mentioned earlier, and that you touched on, Nils, and then I'll turn after I get your response. I'll turn to Olivia for some of her reflections. You basically make the argument that the contemporary international system is essentially unable to rise to the occasion. And I guess what I'd love to do is get a little bit more of a sense from you, Nils, as to why sovereign states can't meet the moment working collectively through bodies as the UN. I mean, one could have, when you look at, COVID-19 was part of the problem, just that Donald Trump was president of the United States, and if somebody else had been there, could it have been better? How is, in a sense, managing carbon and microbes? Yes, they're not necessarily maybe the same thing as managing trade flows, but how is it different from managing other aspects of global interdependence in other regimes? And yeah, I guess you did mention a number of things that would fit into that category. Ocean acidification, which obviously is a function of sort of the carbon flow, biodiversity degradation, which is a function of human activity. I'm just wondering why, or if you could dig in a little bit more as to why that focus on the nation state and cooperation within intergovernmental organizations or even multi-stakeholder arrangements has been found so wanting.
Right. So I think, great question, Stewart. And that is really the sort of central argument of the book, because as you were saying, part of what we're trying to do in the book is bridge a conversation between Earth system scientists and systems biologists on the one hand, and international relations scholars and policymakers on the other. This is a dialogue that, for the most part, has not taken place very effectively. So the short answer to your question is that the reason why nation states and the multilateral member state system of interstate cooperation are fundamentally unable to deal with these kinds of planetary challenges is that's not what they were set up to deal with. What nation states were set up to deal with primarily, and the rise of the nation state and the rise to hegemony of the nation state as the central unit of governance delivery in the 20th century, was basically designed to deal with things that were inside of national borders. So specifically, and most importantly, issues of economic development. That was the central focus of the nation state during the 20th century. At the same time, as the nation state became hegemonic with decolonization, you had the rise of the multilateral member state system centered on the UN system, which was basically for helping nation states cooperate with one another, particularly in conflictual situations. And those conflicts were basically arising out of conflicting human desires. So it was focused entirely on dealing with human-centered things. So it makes sense to do multilateral member state institutions for dealing with things like trade. The World Trade Organization or GATT before the WTO were meant to help nation states negotiate their trade relationships, right? Or thinking about things having to do with the flows of money. We have all sorts of institutions for dealing with that. These are fundamentally human things, and the institutions that were set up during the 20th century were designed to deal with those kinds of challenges. They were not designed to deal with challenges which exceed our borders, which are the kinds of problems that former UN General Secretary Kofi Annan called problems without passports. And what he meant by that was that these are problems. It was sort of a double entendre with that phrase, problems without passports, because on the one hand, it was problems. Passports are things that humans have. Animals don't have passports. Carbon molecules don't have passports. Viruses don't have passports, right? And also, passports are things that you use to negotiate relations as you move from one nation state to another nation state. But these kinds of problems of the carbon cycle, problems of viruses, problems of pollution in general, are not things that have passports, and our institutions are not set up to deal with them, and therefore they don't. So people come into these institutions, and sometimes there's been occasions where there's been some successes. The Montreal framework really was pretty successful in abating chlorofluorocarbons, which were causing the hole in the ozone layer in the late 20th century. Or the International Atomic Energy Agency has been reasonably effective at slowing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which obviously, if we detonated all the nuclear weapons, that would be a planetary ecological catastrophe in addition to a human one. There's been some examples that have been somewhat successful, but the fundamental architecture is really not meant to deal with the challenges of planetary of planetary flows. It's meant to deal with rivalrous nation states dealing with rivalries of human intention. It's not meant to deal with things that don't care about human intention at all, like viruses and carbon molecules.
Thank you very much. That really clarifies some things. Did you have a two-finger there?
Yeah. Just to link that to what I was saying before. I mean, you can put this in the history of thinking about biology or ecology, right? Is that scientists, like I said, came to realize it wasn't sufficient to understand individual species in isolation. You need to understand the whole system. So, and this is what, international politics is essentially about: understanding individual countries and their relations among each other without taking into account the whole system, which in this case is the fact that not only are they dealing, is the US dealing with all sorts of individual countries in like a bilateral or even multilateral way, but they're all embedded on this thing called the Earth, that has all these other things, and that as I said, there was this progressive understanding of the importance of whole systems and the importance of understanding, I guess, kind of the totality, not just the individuals in isolation. And what the planetary perspective, we argue, gives that kind of much more holistic view, and allows you to understand that individual nation states are, I guess, structurally unable to deal with the whole because they've been carved out into a part. So there's this conflict between parts and wholes, and that even the sum of all of the parts, which is the UN, doesn't add up to the whole, because the whole requires kind of this unimpeded perspective that simply borders just are a cognitive impediment too.
Fantastic. I want to bring Olivia into the conversation now, perhaps in a couple of different respects. First, to get your thoughts, Olivia, about the planetary, and then also perhaps some thoughts about how an experiment in regional level, at a regional level at least, some of the movement, or it has gone in some of the direction of the EU, that is, that perhaps Nils and John are suggesting for the planetary. It's an imperfect analogy, but certainly probably the closest analogy we have. So I guess the first is, get your thoughts about the planetary and the need for this sort of thinking. I know you work with colleagues at Exeter University, amongst other places, who have been at the forefront of thinking about tipping points in the Earth's climate, but also basically life support systems in general, and probably has, I know, probably reaffirmed your sense that at least the existing system is wanting in the extreme in terms of its ability to sort of address some of these things, and then gets out some initial reflections from you, and we'll have more time to discuss this, but about how the European Union might be thinking about these things in a little bit differently than maybe perhaps in the United States. Thanks.
Thanks, Stewart. I'll start obviously by saying thanks to Nils and Jonathan for writing this book. I think that it's been a long time coming to have this type of reflection. It was already there in some ways, sort of cooking in the background of philosophy with people like Bruno Latour, with Edgar Morin, with Carl Sagan, who were having essentially this intuition that we were in a species on our way essentially to having the kind of reach, the kind of impact, the kind of destiny, almost some would argue, to become essentially this planetary species. The problem, and you identify it very well, Nils and Jonathan, in the book, is that there is a problem of wisdom. And I think that you call it you use a terminology that I find very useful, which is planetary sapience, right? Which is about having the sort of sets of knowledge and data that allows to understand, essentially to read, to discover, to understand essentially what planetary environment we interact with, how we belong to it, how we interact with it. But it's also then a question of how do we use this data to develop the kind of wisdom and values and norms that could then allow us to essentially be in this planet with the type of relationships that truly reflect the fact that we are part of it, but that we've come at the same time to a position of domination or dominion, which is still something that indeed, like we find, and I find it really, really interesting in that respect. We still find the kind of philosophies that Jonathan talks about, how we essentially apply very linear types of thinking and understanding of progress to how we respond to crises or emerging fault lines, essentially at a planetary level, right? When we talk about the climate crisis, for example, we have an IPCC model, right, where we have a carbon tunnel vision, which therefore leads us to having a net zero paradigm, an energy transition paradigm, taking or helping us to transition our current complex civilization away from fossils, but still expanding essentially the type of industrial base, energy intensivity, material intensivity, and other types of environmental externalities that essentially keep on compounding problems. That's what people working on tipping points and planetary boundaries point us towards, right? The fact that technically we can use transition pathways as an incremental bridge or pathway to try and see how we need to adjust over time. But if we depart from the assumption that we can transition the current complex civilization that we have on the other side of the energy transition, the impacts that we will be wreaking on the planet will also have knock-on effects and planetary damages that will be very, very hard to control. And we see also, the same kind of thinking with solutions such as geoengineering, how to modify and how to intervene within the climate system, how to shield the planet away from sun radiation. We also see it with, like the way in which and I think you also talk about it partially, Nils and Jonathan, in your book, like how we try to conquer space. And we were just talking about it, before we came into the event, how some people are essentially arguing we're becoming a multiplanetary species. This is the curve of progress. We've come to that level of being able to conquer on the back of being able to discover other areas of the universe, right? And that type of thinking is simply not working anymore. The problem is that essentially it's imbued with huge amounts of political and economic backing, because we don't know how to transition indeed our institutions, our relationships, our current set of interdependencies, our international peace and architecture systems on the other side of this reality that Nils and Jonathan talk about, which is how do you actually grapple with multiscalar complexity, multi-species complexity, and with this notion of embeddedness. It leads me to the second point that you talk about around, like the EU and the sort of regional sort of attempt to build interconnectedness and interdependency on the back of, complex sets of identities and different nation states. The European Union, to my mind, and obviously I'll be speaking as a true European, right, is one of the most beautiful political attempts that's been done in human history. It came as a result of terrible wars that essentially sort of, brought everyone in Europe to a state of, right, if we don't manage to make it together, we won't ever manage to make it at all. Which is a good way to start, right? To sort of reckon with the fact that we have to depart from the assumption that when we reach such a level of density of violence, of density of destruction, there needs to be something else on the other side. And the beauty essentially of the European Union has been to say, right, so we will use essentially the things that brought us to war and to fight with one another as ways to embed each other more strongly with one another. This was the story essentially of the start of the European Union with the coal and steel community. But here lies the problem, right? We built our interdependency, our political and interdependency, on the back of energy and material intensity. which means that the moment when we tried to belong together, we did so whilst isolating ourselves from the territories upon which we rely, the environments in which we exist, and the planet or larger environment, because at this point we were not talking about the planet, right? It was regional construction, but the sort of ecosystems and ecological services that we needed, but which was never part of the political, economic, and societal construction and DNA to start with. So now we're paying the price for it, because even if you look at the fact that the European Union has argued for the last 5 or 6 years that it has been one of the climate and ecological champions of this world because it has built the Green Deal, which is essentially a set of legislative packages and mechanisms that allow it to transition away from fossil fuel intensity and other types of carbon intensive activities. But it's not exactly true. It's just that we outsource a lot of our carbon intensive activities through supply chains, which are mostly located afterwards in the global south or in other regions in the world, which create themselves systems of violence, which keep on creating these separations in terms of how political and economic systems, which are about development, peace, are still creating essentially externalities, which are now overwhelming not just subnational and national constituencies, but are now overwhelming the capacity of the planet to essentially enable us to cohabit with one another, to build together, both from a built environment perspective, but also actually from a normative perspective, which is what is interesting also about what Nils and Jonathan talk about, right? Like there is a necessity to think of the planet as the necessary common denominator. It is the place where we all belong. It means that everything essentially needs to come out and needs to be constructed as this is the center point, the centerpiece essentially of our political and economic thinking. The problem is that we've come essentially, and I'm very curious to hear Nils's and Jonathan's thoughts about this, but we've come already at a moment, it's a liminal space where the political and economic systems that we've created are already on very brittle ground, they are fragmenting, and it is reigniting the type of construction that has led to domestic, national, or nation state centric responses, which is security dilemmas.
Right.
And that is creating essentially, the type of competition, zero-sum game, which makes planetary subsidiarity extremely difficult to approach at this point in time. And I'm hoping for the very near future that we don't have to come to a point, which is where the European construction started, which is what Clausewitz called, this absolute level of violence, where it simplifies essentially relationships to the point where we can start from scratch again with different assumptions or premises to build from. Stewart, I think that you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I had muted myself because of an ambulance going by as an occupational hazard of living on or working on Massachusetts Avenue. Thank you very much. That was really wonderful, Olivia. I want to, I'm happy to get reflections from both Nils and Jonathan, but I was going to ask Jonathan also about the meaning of multi-level, or as you term it, multiscalar governance, and how this would work in practice, and whether the EU is a model. But I also will invite you to, Olivia put some marvelous things on the table. So if there are other comments you'd like to make in response immediately to what she said, they'd be most welcome.
Yeah. Maybe Nils, you want to go first, and then I'll take that.
Sure. So everything you said, Olivia, couldn't resonate more strongly, I think, for both me and John, both in terms of the framing of the problem and the challenges. Why did the European Union emerge at the moment it did? What the promises of the European Union were at the beginning, and why the things it was set up to do ultimately have also created certain limitations to what it is capable of being. And lastly, the point you were making at the end about how do we think about the question of subsidiarity as a solution to planetary problems in a world where the things that are being delegated to subsidiary elements are entities that are subjected to rising nationalisms. So let me talk to a few of those things. But before I get to that, I just want to go back to the thing you began with, which is this question of linear models versus complexity models. I think this is a really, really important point to underscore. So much of the way in which development and scientific projection has historically worked is to think in terms of linear models. We want to continue to do the things we're doing. We expect that, there's going to be a continuation of systems in a more or less unidirectional way. And those kinds of models are fundamentally at odds with what Earth system science and systems biology has taught us about the way the world actually works, which is that systems that are super duper integrated with one another, which is what ecosystems are. And we live in ecosystems within ecosystems within ecosystems. I mean, our own bodies are little micro ecosystems that are interacting with the ecosystems of the streets that we walk down, that are interacting with the region we live in, that ultimately are interacting with the systems of the planet as a whole. And those kinds of multi-level embedded systems dynamics require a different kind of model than linear projection. They require thinking in terms of what's known as complexity science. And the very concept of tipping points is something that emerges mathematically out of complexity science. The idea is that you can have a set of events that are linear up to a certain point, and then all of a sudden the entire system shifts phases into an entirely different model. And one way to think about that is probably the most intuitive for people who aren't necessarily mathematical biologists is thinking about phase shifts in water, right? We know that water goes from being a solid to suddenly at a certain particular temperature, it becomes a liquid, and at a certain particular temperature, it changes entirely again into a gas, right? And this is like something that happens at a certain point in time. Now, in the case of water, we understand exactly what that happens. It's a relatively simple model as it does phase shifts. In the case of these systems of, ultimately planetary scale system biologies, we're still beginning. We're at the very beginning of understanding all the complexities, and therefore we don't know exactly what the tipping points are. Is there a certain moment? What is the particular temperature at which the temperature in the Russian in Siberia reaches a certain level and the tundra starts to melt, and the methane gases that are currently trapped in the tundra will start to release, and you're going to get a much more rapid process of climate change. We don't know. I mean, there's some theorization about when that could happen, but we don't have a lot of data, and we don't have perfectly well-tuned models. So one of the things that I think is really important, and you brought up the term planetary sapience, which is a term of art that we use in the book that we borrow from one of our colleagues, Benjamin Bratton. Planetary sapience is a key concept for us because it is basically the process of scientific self-understanding of these planetary systems, which are being enabled by planetary scale monitoring and computation. And a lot of that planetary scale modeling and computation is now rooted in complexity science, which is looking for where are the points where we can see a fundamental phase shift or tipping point into a really fundamentally different world, right? And this has happened in global climate historically. It hasn't happened in the last 10,000 years while we've been living in the Holocene. We've been in a remarkably stable period of climate over the last 10,000 years. But if you look at the several 100,000 years before the advent of the Holocene, the end of the last ice age, you had an incredible amount of variability, sometime on a decade by decade or century by century basis in terms of the fluctuations of the climate. And since we built our cities and built agricultural systems, we've had stability. We may be exiting that now in ways that can lead to really, truly chaotic situations that are literally outside the realm of lived human experience or even historical experience. So I'll stop there and just say that I just want to underscore, I think you put your finger on exactly the right point in terms of the biological and scientific substrate of the arguments we're making for political science. And I'll let John talk to that.
So I want to pick up on what you said about the European Union. So the EU, which kind of comes up again and again throughout our book, because it's kind of, as you put it, this example of trying something radically new, and that moves away from the historic model of absolute sovereignty. And for that, I entirely agree with you. I mean, that it is an absolutely beautiful concept. I mean, like the Treaty of Rome, 1957, which founded the European community, which eventually turned into the EU. Is it like a beautiful and inspiring document? I mean, even like it has some like poetic lines, which is maybe you don't usually get from a treaty. And the fundamental what it does is set us up for really new forms of thinking. Now I'll come back with some criticisms in a minute with how that vision is actually played out. But to begin with, like I mean, to quote our colleague and friend Lorenzo Marsili, he likes to say that, well, he says two things about the EU in regards to planetary politics. One, he says it's a laboratory for planetary politics because it is kind of a small scale, continental wide idea of like thinking in terms of the interconnection of flows. And as a result, what he says is he has this great line, what he calls the inverse Sinatra, right? So Sinatra famously saying about New York, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. So what he says about the EU and the planetary is that if the planetary can't happen here, it can't happen anywhere. Which is both raises important possibilities, but also is an important warning, I think, as you were pointing to the limitations of this project. So, I mean, I think despite the fundamental beauty of this idea of that, like emerging from the conflicts of the first half of the 20th century and saying, let's not do that again. Let's aim for a better life for all of us by tying ourselves together and getting rid of some of the privileges. Political privileges that we held on for a long time, and thinking more holistically. I think, as you pointed to, right, and the clue is in that they originally founded as a union around coal and steel, was placing economics at the center of it all, in particular about the making of the common market and freedom of movement of capital, essentially. And this ends up, I think, being the fundamental flaw of the union, because then I mean, and there are like many reasons this is the case, but I think just to take one, because when you elevate economics, in particular what we would now call neoliberal economics, or more technically in the EU's case, like ordoliberal economics, this sets you up to basically be this efficiency machine, economic efficient machine that lets you kind of overrule any other sort of issue that might have, and as a result, you end up doing things like outsourcing your carbon to the global south or whatnot, and this then points, I guess, to the limitation of regionalism generally, and what taking a planetary perspective would allow you to do, because in the case of the European Union, right. They are able to get green by moving the dirty stuff elsewhere, because it's a regional arrangement. But what the planetary suggests is that there is no outside, right? There is no elsewhere. There's no such thing as an externality. It's all inside. So unlike the EU, which one of the fundamental dynamics, political dynamics of the entire history is this inside-outside dynamic. Right, like Turkey, there's the whole will they, won't they with Turkey, expansion over the time. But fundamentally, there's this sense that like there's us, the Europeans, and then there's everyone else. But when you take this planetary perspective, that seems comes to make no sense.
John, can I pick up? Let me pick up on a couple of points and get you and Nils to respond to them. There are a couple of really intriguing things. One of them is if you go in a little bit more detail about sort of multiscalar, and obviously the European Union has its own, there's the whole concept of subsidiarity. I'm sort of wondering how that works with respect to your model, because what's interesting is that your model doesn't simply talk about, on a limited selective basis, moving up to the supranational in a sense. So that, which is very different from the intergovernmental, right? Because it actually presumes some sort of relationship of, the hierarchy and subordination to some degree, at least in a limited sense, in terms of moving authority up to above, in a sense, the nation state. But you also talk about moving it downward. And so two things. One, how does the scale work, just walk us through either, carbon or microbes, right? And then the other question is, what about sovereignty, which is obviously one of the bugbears of the European Union, or at least with respect to some of the problems that it's running into now. What is sort of, in a sense, multiscalar planetary governance mean for the concept of sovereignty? Does that mean it has to be jettisoned, or does it have to, in a sense, be reconceived as being shared amongst different levels? Because that obviously, you mentioned, not just China, but the United States, in terms of talk about a country that's pretty obsessed with its sovereignty. And so sort of thinking about, ultimately how we don't have to get into totally how we get from here to there, but thinking about how one apportions sovereignty as well as authority in this scheme that you're talking about.
Okay, great question, Stewart. Let me take the first one, and I'll let John take the second one on sovereignty. So let me give you a kind of a schematic model for how we imagine the way subsidiarity would work with respect to carbon, for example, and dealing with climate change. So schematically, you can think about sort of three scales of government. You can think about the planetary scale, the national scale, and the local scale, subnational or regional scale, regional within a country, not regional in the sense of the European Union. Obviously, some countries have more levels than that, but let's schematically think about it that way. And then climate change has really two dimensions to it, right? There's the mitigation piece, which is about trying to limit the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere. And then there is the adaptation, which is much more local. How is climate change affecting a particular place at a particular time, right? And the mitigation problem is a fundamentally planetary problem. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't matter whether the smokestack or the tailpipe is in one part of the world or another. It's all going into the same atmosphere that we all share. So in terms of dealing with mitigation, we need to be setting binding standards for total global emissions, all right? And the model that we have in mind, and this might be a transitional model, is that there would be effectively an IPCC with teeth and authority to actually set binding emission limits that would then be delegated down to national governments to figure out how to implement, right? So there would be a carbon budget, essentially, that France would have, the United States would have, South Africa would have, India would have, et cetera. And then the national governments, because carbon obviously very deeply intersects with economic issues, would have to figure out how do they want to implement that, right? Do they want to electrify the transportation grid? Do they want to build nuclear power plants or solar? Some of that will depend on local political preferences. Some of that will depend on local ecological circumstances. How much sunlight do you have? What's your access to uranium, et cetera, et cetera. So and then the actual implementation often happens at a very local level, right? A nuclear power plant is going to be built in a particular place. So at the level of mitigation, that's how we imagine the cascade would work. At the level of adaptation, we're imagining a different model, which is that for the most part, except in very small countries that have a uniform ecology, there's a lot of variability even in any given country about how climate change is affecting the different parts of the country, and therefore what the adaptation strategies need to be. So let me just give an example from the United States. John and I live in Los Angeles. Los Angeles faces significant challenges from climate change that are specifically related to heat waves, fires, and droughts. Those are the major things that affect Mediterranean climates in the southwest corners of continents. Take another part of the United States like Miami. Miami also faces major threats from climate change, but those are basically related to sea level rise and intensifying hurricanes, right? So it's a very different set of challenges. And there's no reason why Washington, D.C. should be setting a climate adaptation strategy that's uniform from California to Florida, right? Now, it may want to be providing resources to both places to help manage the adaptation, but fundamentally the adaptation needs to be dealt with locally based on the particular environmental challenges that Miami faces as opposed to Los Angeles. However, at the same time, this doesn't mean simply that Miami or Los Angeles needs to be on their own. Los Angeles has an opportunity to collaborate and should be collaborating, and in fact already is collaborating, with other cities in the southwest corners of continents that face similar kinds of challenges, drought, fire, and heat waves. So Los Angeles' challenges are very similar to those facing, for example, Perth, Australia, or the Iberian Peninsula, or Cape Town, because those all have similar ecological niches on their continent. Miami, on the other hand, has a lot more in common with a place like Ho Chi Minh City, another low-lying place where you get a lot of typhoons, that therefore has to deal with flooding and typhoon-related risk. And so networks of expertise about how to adapt to the local particular manifestation of climate change in the ecologically particular way of a spot on the Earth is something that should be dealt with. And the term that John and I use in the book is translocal networked governance, right? So that you can have networks of regions that are facing similar adaptation challenges, sharing resources and expertise about how to do that. One of the examples we give in the book that's sort of interesting is Jakarta in Indonesia and Rotterdam in the Netherlands. These are both, cities that are basically right at sea level, where the water table is, 1 inch below the surface. There's also an interesting sort of colonial historical relationship between Indonesia and the Netherlands. And they're now cooperating on urban water management because they're both facing challenges related to rising sea levels. So there's a whole bunch of examples like that. So I'll stop there and let John talk about the problem of sovereignty.
So, right. So, I mean, sovereignty, what we try and do in the book, as we do with a lot of concepts, is trace a bit of history and kind of understand that these things that today seem entirely immutable and entirely natural and kind of like, have just always been here is not the case, right? So, in the case of sovereignty, this is a concept, it's been around a long time. I'm not saying it's new, but it comes from the 16th, 17th century in Europe, where it was developed essentially as a principle to protect kings from other kings, to say that, well, I can do whatever I want here, and you can't stop me. And I guess that makes sense if your primary threat, the primal thing you're concerned with, is like being taken over by another country, by another king. But it doesn't really make sense in a world where I'm not saying that threat has gone away, but we now face all these other threats for which it just doesn't make sense. So we kind of we're stuck with this relic of king worship essentially in this system where it doesn't really make sense anymore, and it leads to all sorts of problems. So sovereignty is supposed to protect the national interest, but you end up with situations all the time that the assertion of sovereignty, runs contra the national interest. So just last week, the world was supposed to be presented with a new pandemic treaty at the World Health Assembly in Geneva. These negotiators have been working for 2 years to develop something, and it kind of word leaked out a couple days before the meeting that the treaty didn't, the negotiators couldn't come up with a treaty, and you have all these quotes from politicians and leaders in around the world basically saying, like, we're not going to sign something that hurts our sovereignty, and I'm like, and the point is, like, okay, great, but then when the next pandemic comes, like, as we learned before, like, retreating to sovereignty doesn't do anything. Because you can't just say can't say to a virus in the way that you would say to your neighbor, the king next door, like, I'm sovereign. You can't touch me. You gotta leave me alone. And it's just nonsensical. So, and of course, the same story is happens every year at every COP, right? That countries say, well, I got to protect my domestic oil industry or whatever it is. So in this kind of singular placement, so the question is, well, what do we do with it, right? And I think one thing we want to point to is that right now there's a single sovereign form in the world. Like, sovereignty is held by nation states, and nation states hold sovereignty. That's basically what their almost defining feature is at this point. But historically, that's not the case. Sovereignty used to be held by all sorts of entities, and lots of different entities besides nation states used to be members of kind of good and equal standing of the international system. And some of those things are not necessarily ones we want to return to, like empires, colonies, things like the East India Company having full standing in international politics and be able to wield violence for its own interests is not a world we want to return to. But it is worth remembering that there were other ways to think about sovereignty, to practice sovereignty, different organizations or institutions that could hold on to it and wield it in interesting and important ways, which is all to say that I think moving beyond this one-size-fits-all model, that the nation state, the sovereign nation state, I should say, is kind of the appropriate authority kind of for everything, and given the right, essentially the right of first refusal for any problem that emerges. Right, climate change for a long time, most of human history was not a problem. We didn't know about the climate, anything like that, and then suddenly we were like, okay, there's such a thing as a global climate, and we're screwing it up, and then what's the solution? In 1992, all the members of the UN come together in Rio de Janeiro and say, okay, let's sign the UNFCCC, because there really is no other way within the current model to deal with it. All the sovereign states have to come together and sign an agreement and kind of pledge to do things together. But we want to encourage people to think about the other models, not just of institutionalization, but also like other models of thinking about what sovereignty could be. Right, so sovereignty today is what the philosopher Isaiah Berlin would call like a negative freedom. Right, it's the freedom from other things. It's the freedom from intervention, the freedom from being told what to do by others. But there's another really important sense of freedom that Berlin points out, which is the freedom to. So rather than thinking about sovereignty as simply a freedom to autonomy, a freedom to national autonomy, where might we get if we start thinking about like some sort of positive freedom, like the freedom to thrive, some sort of way of thinking that this notion of that sovereignty could provide us with something, positive.
I think that's really interesting, and actually, I mean, in some ways, in a different way, Joe Stieglitz's new book about globalization talks about sort of frames freedom very much in that framework, to sort of argue against sort of a neoliberal appreciation of freedom, and sort of in a sense giving people the capacities. And I know that Abram and Tony Chase also in their writings on sovereignty did a very good job of thinking about it. Well, if it's influencing your fate as a nation, then including to deal with things like climate change, then you may think about it a little bit differently than in the past. Olivia, I definitely want to come back to you here. There's a lot of issues that I know the European Union has grappled with in terms of, what all this means for democracy, what all this implies or requires in terms of multiple levels of identity. And I just wonder if you have any reflections on some of the things that's been said about, how if you were going to move towards multiscalar governance, you might either draw some lessons, positive or negative, from the European Union. But I'll invite you to any other reflections you have on the conversation as it's been unfolding.
It's incredibly rich. It's incredibly large. I don't even know where to start. Because obviously, we could start from what is going on right now, right? We're 3 days away from really important elections that will define the future of the European Union, of the Green Deal, of the peace project in and of itself, because we expect essentially a bunch of radical rights parties to come into the European Parliament, and therefore to have essentially to bring back a legacy which is almost counter to what the EU was built upon. So it sort of creates some fundamental identity questions about an idea, right? This is the result of, to a certain extent, the problem with which we addressed subsidiarity, which is, if I again sort of look back at the history of an idea, the European Union was created out of the necessity and the inspiration to create peace. And peace in this particular context of history was not just an aspiration. It was a necessity that turned into an architecture. So it was an idea that was turned into an exoskeleton. And I think that Jonathan and Nils, you sort of also talked about it. We try to systematize the idea to the extent that it created essentially economic interdependencies. The economic interdependencies created the single market. The single market created a form of power, which had this strange thing of being both normative, because it was about also how to create, essentially, how to use economics to try and push certain values, which at the time we thought were universal. Now there's a big question mark as to whether or not universalism will retain any value as we go about the current sort of, fragmentation of geopolitics and also fragmentation of the European Union. But it also, because it was a form of power, and power needs to maintain itself in order to compete with other forms of power, economics became a logic, a past dependency. And so the exoskeleton started defining the idea. We went from being a peace project to being an economic project, and the economic started to define what peace should be about. And now we're essentially sort of, falling into that trap where we don't really know how to maintain this notion of peace at a moment when, and this is really interesting because it goes back to this notion of nestedness, embeddedness into larger systems. The European Union is stuck essentially in a world where it's been trying to exercise normative power, but it's, much like any other middle power, really stuck in a geopolitical escalation between the US and China. And this escalation, the factors that define this escalation around the use of technology, the sort of power of capital investments and capital flows, the power of military sort of presence or capacity, the power of demography, the power of many different, things that are quite sort of hard power defined, leave the European Union feeling very lost as to what its own peace project is and how to exercise it, not just outside, but also inside. And so we've essentially sort of, come into something where originally the subsidiarity was about how to pool together different resources, pool different nations, how to build this notion of identity over time via a number of different projects, such as even the Erasmus project, which is, this educational exchange between a number of different countries, how to build sort of multilinguistic capacity even within the institutions. But the institutions developed mandates, technical competencies, which over time siloed the capacity to adapt and to let this notion of peace in and of itself evolve. Because that's what we forgot. Peace is something which is alive, right? It needs to actually sort of evolve over time. It needs to respond to some of the risks, the fault lines, the learnings even that arise as time passes by.
Go ahead.
And I'll just, end on this. Because of the bureaucratic nature of subsidiarity, which is essentially sort of, constraining the ability of the European project to advance, we're now sort of, fragmenting in many different ways, including in identity politics. And that is going to be reflected on Sunday with the vote, where a lot of Europeans will actually turn up at the voting polls and say, I'm voting for or against my government. Europe will probably have very little to do with it, because a lot of people have forgotten what Europe is for, what it needs to do, how it can lead, not, as a matter of leading ahead of anybody, but experimenting essentially with an architectural construction that had never really been done before. So we will probably break as a result of the type of subsidiarity that we tried, but we will evolve. That's the story of Europe as well. We break, we burn, and from the ashes, we come back. And we come back with a different type of inspiration.
Yeah, it's interesting. You might want to get some reflections as to whether or not, to the degree that there's evolution going on, or we expect it in terms of planetary institutions, whether or not we expect phyletic gradualism, or will this be a case of punctuated equilibrium after a after a major catastrophe? But I do want to pick up on something, Olivia, because you mentioned the market, and of course the European project obviously began with the European cold steel community, against the weapons of war, and in a sense harnessing sort of German industrial potential for peace. But then very quickly, as you point out, the common market, the economic and monetary union, et cetera, the raison d'etre there, which, you know, makes me channel my inner Marxist, which is, we haven't said much about capitalism here, right? And about how it relates to any schemes for planetary institutions, or in a sense, planetary level multiscalar governance. You know, because of course we're embedded in a global market system obsessed with profits that treats, as we've talked about, environmental damage as externalities, which I think means not my department from the perspective of corporations, and just the cost of doing business, right? So I guess one of the big questions for our authors in particular, but also Olivia, is, you know, is this project, you know, does it require any assumptions about, you know, degrowth or turning, you know, fundamental transformations in global capitalism, or and even a concept of growth, or is it sort of agnostic on some of those matters?
Well, what I would say is, for us, in terms of what we're specifically spelling out in the book in terms of architectural models for governance, we're agnostic from the point of view of the central argument of the book about whether degrowth is required. John and I may differ a little bit on this topic, actually, because we haven't worked it out together in the book. But I'll just say that for myself personally, I'm skeptical of projects of degrowth, politically skeptical, and even ethically skeptical of projects of degrowth. I'm politically skeptical that people are willing to put on the hair shirt for the sake of larger causes. I think it is worth trying to think about multi-generational justice questions, but how much people are actually willing to sacrifice for those kinds of things, I'm skeptical of. I'm also skeptical of it for another set of ethical reasons, which is that, you know, there's been a massive reduction in poverty over the last 20, 30 years, but there's still a tremendous number of very poor people in the world, whose lives, and these, by the way, are the people who will suffer most from climate change in particular, in most cases, because they don't have as many resources that will allow them to adapt to climate change. I think that mitigating the likely terrible human effects of climate change requires resources. Where I do think there's an important point, though, to be made is that I'm also, relatively speaking, not just a techno-optimist, but a believer that, like, technology has to be part of our story for how we're going to get to a better and more habitable, sustainably habitable world. A major question, though, is whether the current system of technology management rooted in intellectual property is going to get us to where we need to go. I do think that we need to have massive reforms in this area, because we are on the verge of creating many kinds of green technologies, but currently these are proprietary, and we need to roll these things out as quickly as possible so that we can do a green energy transition. If we just do that on the basis for making the green energy companies maximize their profits, this means they're going to restrict markets to markets that have resources to spend on it. We should take a lesson from what went wrong with the pandemic. I think one of the great failures of American foreign policy of this century was, or this decade, was the failure to maximize the distribution of vaccines around the world in the context of the pandemic. This could have been an enormous win. And by the way, would have been good for us if we had done it, right? It would have been good for us if we had distributed the vaccines more broadly than we did. And it's one of these things that's actually shocked me. The US could have made a pledge as we were developing our vaccines, not only to buy enough vaccines to vaccinate the American population, but also to buy enough vaccines to vaccinate the whole world. And that would have been an act of beneficence on one level, but it also would have been an act of microbial wisdom, because it would have been a way to prevent the continuation of the pandemic for another couple of years. It would have been a win-win-win. We could have given corporate financial aid to pharmaceutical companies, something people in Washington love to do. We could have increased the vaccination rates, and we could have done something good for the global South. And instead, we just totally fell down on that. I think and by the way, there's a huge amount of, in my opinion, quite justified resentment in the global South about the inequitable access to the vaccine. This is a microcosm, a microbial microcosm, or an analogy to the things that we ought to be doing and not doing with respect to green technology. We really should be having rich countries investing in the development of these technologies and then in the massive global distribution of these to all people around the world. And this is a major thing. And I think that there are ways in which that can intersect fine with capitalism. Companies that come up with really good green technologies will get massive purchase agreements and will get bigger markets if they're guaranteed by rich countries. Under Donald Trump, that was never going to happen, right? That's why it didn't happen in the US. I'm a little less clear about what went on with the politics of vaccine distribution in the European Union. I don't know the details of that quite as much, but I do think we need to have a technology distribution system that is going to be able to accelerate our ability to a more prosperous world that also is a more habitably and sustainably habitable world.
So we might want to bring in then the word institutions to this conversation, right? Because what we envision, actually the title of the event is, do we need planetary institutions to solve planetary problems? We actually haven't really talked about planetary institution too much. But this vision that we have of some sort of new entity that operates at the planetary scale and that understands its mandate and its constituency to be the entire planet would allow for these sort of distributional arrangements, but also just a whole new mentality. I mean, Olivia, we were talking about in some sense the failure of the European project to develop a European-wide identity. Though in some ways it's actually been quite successful. But the point being, there was really no European identity at all before the creation. The institutions came first, and then the identity followed. And this is true basically universally. Institutions typically precede identities. And right now, we don't have a planetary identity that allows people to say, like, oh, yeah, of course, we should be vaccinating everyone everywhere because, like, we're all planetary creatures. We're all planetary beings. This would have made a lot of sense, but we just don't have the institutional capacity to kind of signal to us and shape the way we think, in addition to creating the capacity to do so. So that's my response, Olivia. If you want to jump in, I don't know.
Yeah,
and Olivia, we may give you close to the last word here. I think we've got probably got 3 more minutes to go.
I'll try. Stewart is very large, but also bringing up capitalism, growth, within the same sort of sentence. So the moment when technically we would need another hour, specifically also with Jonathan, to go back through the history of capitalism, because it's an idea that evolved, right? And what's interesting is that the degrowth, let's say, movement or conversation is very sort of vibrant at the moment in the European Union, and it comes as a function of a history of a certain type of capitalism, which was social capitalism. It was not Marxist, it was not communist. It was essentially this notion that the state had a function in trying to create public goods that were both societal, environmental, political, etc., which enabled cohabitability. And I really want to sort of mention this because this is something that Nils and Jonathan, you talk about, right? The philosophy of habitability, which you embed within the planet. But also, and this is also why the European experiment is quite interesting, it started with this notion of how do you create an environment where everybody has a place, and what are the political infrastructures and economic infrastructures that will enable that? The result of political the type of political capitalism that Europe invested into is that there are greater social goods. There is less of, when you look at planetary boundaries, the European Union countries tend to be less an overshoot than a country like the United States, for example, because there is more of a coherence in terms of what is the societal project that we try to establish, which limits the amount of private wealth accumulation and tries to provide as much as possible social safety nets. This is already quite an interesting way to look at it. And today, the degrowth community in Europe is saying it's not about sacrifice per se, it's about how you invest resources in the type of social goods that will enable essentially a different type of habitability between people, but also between people and their environment, and between people in Europe and other places in the world, right? How that works, however, is a problem today specifically, because the moment when there are security dilemmas at play, you need growth, because growth is a function of security, it's a function of power, And it's a function essentially of technological accumulation that allows you to compete. That's why we have essentially fundamentally disruptive and polarized views about what is the function of growth. That's because we're not even re-embedding it within the type of political and economic projects that are attuned to the reality of the times and attuned to the realities that we are aiming to create, and whether or not we can create them together as an international community.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all three of you for just this incredibly rich conversation on an issue of paramount importance, but obviously incredible nuance and complexity. And as Olivia intimated, we could definitely be here for another hour, if not another day or so. For everyone who is participating online, I commend again Children of a Modest Star. Please get it at a bookstore or an Amazon marketplace near yourself. And we really look forward to continuing the conversation with all three of you, my friends. It's, again, congratulations again, John and Nils, for just a terrific book. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Olivia.
Thank you. Thank you both. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye now.